Rebecca, what are the biggest challenges that you face as a leader, whether it's daily, quarterly, yearly, and how have you kind of evolved in your leadership mindset to try to address or be proactive around some of them?
One of the biggest challenges is managing energy, because there's so many things that come up through the day. There was times when I felt like I was sort of just crawling to the end of the day because I hadn't really had a plan for managing energy. So that's a big thing I'm thinking about now is what can I do before work, during work, and after work to really maximize, what I can do. Yeah, everything else sort of flows from that. And then quarterly, it goes back to what we were already talking about, reviewing what's working, what isn't working, and
You're an engineer, an architect, or a technical professional looking to be the best leader you can be. Well, I have an exciting episode for you today. I have with me Rebecca Swabey. Rebecca's a professional engineer, but she also founded a tech startup, and she's been a leader in that space. And in today's episode, she's going to share some of the things that she's learned from creating and growing a tech startup, and how those things can apply to you as a technical professional building your career within a larger company as a leader. And these are things that if you apply them, I promise you'll be a better leader tomorrow. And a lot of it is around getting the proper feedback early on from your clients and your team members, but how you can do just that. I'm excited to bring you the information in today's episode. I am Anthony Fasano, and this is the AEC Leadership Podcast. Now, I'd like to welcome our guest onto the show for today, Rebecca Swabey. Rebecca is a professional engineer. She is also the CEO and co-founder of Equator Studios. And an exciting announcement here, she's also going to become the co-host of this show, the AEC Leadership Podcast, with me going forward, which we'll talk about here throughout the episode. But Rebecca, welcome aboard.
Thank you so much. So excited to be here and to be co-hosting with you, Anthony.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. So Rebecca was a co-host for our Women in Engineering podcast, which did well, but we felt that the whole idea of spotlighting women in engineering would be done better if we, instead of having it as its own podcast, we kind of created spotlights for women in engineering across our entire platform. So we're kind of making that shift from a podcast to a spotlight. So we're still excited to promote women in engineering. But with that change, we've asked Rebecca if she'd kind of jump over and co-host the Leadership Podcast here with me. She has done quite a bit of things related to leadership in her career, one of them being starting up a tech company and growing it, which we're going to talk about today. And I think a good place for us to maybe get started, Rebecca, for those listeners that don't know you, maybe you could share a little bit about your background and your journey from private consulting to kind of tech entrepreneurship. Just talk about that transition and kind of maybe what it's meant to your leadership style.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a topic that I am very excited to dive into on the podcast. I'll start by sharing a bit about my background. I graduated from environmental engineering. I studied in Canada at the University of Guelph and got started working at a pretty big engineering consulting company up in Canada, doing a lot of work to support land development. So stormwater management studies, pipe design, creek restoration, which was really exciting, but just always sort of in the back of my mind feeling like maybe this wasn't the end. There was something else more out there. So I ended up going to a smaller engineering company, sort of like an engineering startup, which gave me more flexibility to try things even outside of work. And the city that I'm living in, it's Waterloo in Canada. It's sort of like what we like to think ourselves as like Silicon Valley North. So there's a lot of tech going on up here. We have the University of Waterloo, and it really just swallows you up. If you have any hint of an interest, there's an event for you. And I found I could eat for free almost every night of the week just by attending these tech events. So lots of pizza at that time, and stumbled into a hackathon. We were solving problems related to water quality in Lake Erie using technology to do that. Got on a team. Long story short, we ended up being one of the winners of that hackathon. We got some funding to start, and I hadn't necessarily thought, entrepreneurship is something that I want to do. When I was younger, I hadn't thought about that. But this whole process, I just fell in love with entrepreneurship. And one thing led to another, and we'd incorporated a company. And that was really how we got the start. So for the past 6 years, we've been growing Equator Studios. We could talk more about it, but a lot of it is in response to the needs in the civil engineering market. So we make software to support civil engineering workflows, especially in the early stages of the project. So when you kick off a new job or you're bidding on a new proposal, we help companies access really great LiDAR data. so they can basically save time on the topographic survey. And now we've just recently launched an AI proposal writer. So another thing to help the early stage of the project. We know how expensive it is to submit proposals, and engineers' time is valuable, and not everybody likes to write. So that's what we've done, is help automate parts of the process that were just eating up time.
That's great. And we did, James Taylor, our co-host of the Civil Engineering Podcast, did interview Rebecca for a full episode talking about, the product and the LiDAR. And it's really interesting stuff. And as an entrepreneur myself, it is exciting to see another engineer that has kind of made that leap into entrepreneurship, because I think when you combine kind of the engineering analytical background mindset with an entrepreneurial mindset, it can be exciting, right? And a lot can come out of it. And
we're natural problem solvers, right? Like, it's
right,
just
exactly.
put us anywhere and we'll try to figure out a way to engineer a solution to it.
Yeah, and I think the civil engineering, the civil infrastructure world where we live is really an area where there are a lot of problems that need to be solved. And there are a lot of potential opportunities that AI and tech can bring to the table to help with that. That's why I think it's a really exciting time.
Yeah, 100%.
So, Rebecca, what do you do in your current role as CEO at Equator Studios, and how is leading a software company similar to or maybe different from leading an engineering consulting firm?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, at the highest level, when you start, we were a startup when we started. It's not necessarily like a professional services business when you have some expertise that you're selling right from the get-go. We had intended to build software to help solve problems in the industry, which means that on day one, we had nothing. So we had nothing to sell. So really, a lot of the job is, presenting your idea to people that might back you. That could be private investors, that could be banks, that could be, pitch competitions, whatever it is. So it's really, at the highest level, it's securing funding. And then, of course, developing that's supported by a plan to understand like how you're going to effectively use that funding to achieve some sort of goal and ultimately grow revenue. And then probably even more importantly, because a lot of companies, they can secure funding, they can start to build something, but it's very rare that everything goes according to plan. So more importantly, paying attention to what's working and what isn't, and pivoting when it's not towards a better path. That's a big part of the job, I'll say, but the job itself changes every single month. There's a different need, something new that comes up. I've never personally led an engineering firm, but I can imagine that maybe one of the big differences is for a startup software company, there's always this like existential threat of like running out of funds before you get to the point of profitability. So, that's something that's very hand to mouth. We count in the early days, we counted in months. How many months of runway do you have in the bank, basically? And so that's probably a little bit different from, selling professional services. But what's similar is the people side of it. And I just wanted to mention, people are equally as important to my business, and finding creative people. We are solving problems that in some cases haven't been solved before, maybe similar to an engineering consulting company. Like obviously you have your expertise, you're trying to make something fit within given constraints. We're doing the same thing. So finding those great people, keeping them happy, and then putting them on a path to progress within the company is a primary concern.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that you said that I think is very similar to engineering is changes constantly happening, right? Because I know on engineering projects, we do a lot of project management training, and a big part of it is knowing that your project is going to change every day, right? Whatever the scope was initially is not going to be the scope that it ends up with at the end of the project. There'll be a lot of twists and turns along the day. So I think that change management, staying on your toes type of mindset is something that you're going to deal with in the tech world, you're going to deal with in the engineering world. And I think the other thing that I would say, an interesting way to think about this conversation that Rebecca and I are having as an engineer working in a company, is there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for engineers in corporations today to try new things, meaning a new service line for your company, right? Doing more with AI, trying to deliver a project differently, or changing your project delivery process. So I'm hoping that some of the things that we talk about today that Rebecca's kind of encountered in her tech startup can be something that you can apply trying to do something creative within your organization. Because I do think that the engineering organizations that are going to get creative, going to get more innovative, going to embrace AI in certain areas are going to be the firms that will be leaders. And so, one of the thoughts in kind of having Rebecca on today to talk through her experience is I think there'll be some analogous, instances there of Rebecca has to start something up with a product. You have to start something up with a new service line or a new way to do something just to keep up with everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, in the startup world, there's the concept of the MVP. What's the minimum viable product, right? And the temptation is always to spec out something pretty major. We're great at solving problems. You can spec out this ultimate solution that's like the perfect scenario. But the problem is when it takes 12 months to plan something, you're not actually getting great data or feedback on how well it's working. So the advice that we get in the software space is to fail often, fail quickly. It's actually the most cost-effective way to do it is if you can be trying out a new program or a new technology or a new pilot in a couple of weeks even, or a couple of months, say it didn't work, you're still better off than having spent 12 months speculating without any data coming in.
Yeah, I think that's another good analogy because I think on projects, it's good as an engineer to have some kind of concept plan or conceptual design that you can bring to your stakeholders, bring to your clients early on in the project and get feedback before you spend 40, 80, 100 hours designing it to the end and then bringing it to them, right? So
It's
I think
exactly that. Yeah.
having that open feedback loop is really important, whether you're in a tech startup or you're in an engineering company where you're delivering projects or widgets or whatever you're designing, right? The more feedback you can get and keep it interactive, the better. So I think that those are a couple of definitely important analogies. So Rebecca, what are the biggest challenges that you face as a leader, whether it's daily, quarterly, yearly, and, how have you kind of evolved in your leadership mindset to try to address or be proactive around some of them?
Yeah, so I think on a daily basis, and this is very personal for me, but one of the biggest challenges is managing energy because there's so many things that come up through the day, so much task switching, so many decisions to make, so many things that can catch you off guard. There was times when I felt like I was sort of just crawling to the end of the day because I hadn't really had a plan for managing energy. So that's a big thing I'm thinking about now is what can I do before work, during work, and after work to really maximize, what I can do. It makes me feel good and it's good for the company too. Because, yeah, everything else sort of flows from that. And then quarterly, it goes back to what we were already talking about, reviewing what's working, what isn't working, and making changes. So, and especially bringing in other people that you trust. We have a great board of directors that can provide alternative perspectives, but also others in the industry from time to time, bringing them in and getting like a second opinion because sometimes you get stuck on tunnel vision and keep beating a dead horse and you don't realize you're doing it. So quarterly, that's the biggest thing is just being really intentional about figuring out what isn't working, what is, and then how to adjust investments. And then on a yearly basis, I would say it comes back to just looking back up at the big vision of what you're trying to do in the industry. Does it still make sense, the broader direction that you're heading, and is everything still aligned within it? There was times in the early days, when we started building mapping software that we thought, oh, we can build software for not just civil, this can be used by and list A, B, C, D, all these different industries horizontally. And we sort of lost the plot a little bit. And so that's what the yearly exercise is really, it's important to do is make sure that you've really crafted a vision and a mission intentionally so that the activities, the quarterly and the daily activities throughout the year serve that effectively.
Yeah, I think that's great. And, we won't go into it a lot of detail today, but I think we could do an episode on this together in terms of your like setting up your day to be successful as a leader. I think that's really important. Your morning routine. I've been using the Pomodoro technique a lot. If you're not familiar with it and you're listening, it's basically like you set a timer for like 25, 30 minutes. You block everything else out. You work on one task. You get through that 30 minutes. You take maybe a break and then you do it again as many times as you need to get that task done. But really what it does is it kind of blocks everything else out. It's really helpful. So, we could probably come up with a whole episode for our listeners on different ways to set yourself up for success for the day. But I think, the reason I asked that is because I think as a leader, you need to do constant adapting, right? Being flexible, changing things as a leader, as your company grows, as your team grows, as your client needs grow, and you need to kind of adjust accordingly. And I think some of the things that Rebecca said, quarterly, checking in on things, what's working, what's not working, right? Annually, like, are we headed in the right direction? Is our North Star still the same? Like, did we change something? Or are we getting off path a little bit? So I think it's just an important message for leaders out there, is that there's kind of like a constant calibration that needs to happen to make sure that you're on the top of your game, because things around you are going to change. And that's something that's just always going to be evolving.
Yeah, what's
Essentially.
in your control, what's out of your control, what are the dynamics in the market that to some extent, you don't have much control over. So it's observing them and then realigning.
Exactly. So, Rebecca, what is your approach to managing your team effectively, especially when you work in such a fast moving tech environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest things is really, I like to give my team a lot of trust and autonomy. I like to try to find people that genuinely are interested in the topics that they'll be working on at work and are creative outside of the actual job that they need to do. I can sort of see that they're just great problem solvers in general in their life as a whole, and then give them a lot of freedom and trust to be able to solve problems in the way that they feel best fit. I usually, at the beginning, beyond training, after they've been trained, they understand the expectations of their role, step back as much as possible and just see how well they can perform in that sense. And then you sort of step it back if they need more guidance and management in that sense. But that's worked really well. I found that the people that have contributed the most to the organization and to the product are those people that really are, they're like mini entrepreneurs, to be honest. And so now I can recognize a little bit better, who's got that personality type and bring them in. That said, there are certain roles in the organization that don't necessarily require a mini entrepreneur. There's some roles that are more, you're responsible for doing the same thing over and over, and you need somebody who's reliable, who can follow the plan. So for example, like a customer success role, like there might be a playbook in place and we need somebody to execute that effectively. And so what kind of people would be better suited for that, where there's a little bit less creativity and flexibility? You're more executing against a given plan. So yeah, that's generally been my approach in the fast-moving tech scene, is just making sure that the people are able to make decisions most of the time on their own, good decisions without too much oversight.
Yeah, and we're not intentionally doing this, but I think we're coming up with topics that we can do as additional episodes, because I think this idea that Rebecca touched on of, I like to call it somehow like knowing how long the leash can be with someone, meaning, some people you can let them go and just go off on their own and they're going to figure it out. You're going to give them a limited amount of instructions. Other people, maybe you need to give them a lot more context, keep them closer to you in the beginning and really get them set up for success before you can kind of let them go. And then some people, it's kind of in between, right? So I think it's not something that there's an equation for or a software for in terms of how you manage and people in that respect. I think it's more of like a gut feel from a leader as to, you definitely want to let people, I think to Rebecca's point, be able to flourish on their own, be able to go and do things and build up their confidence. But there probably is a level of runway for each person that's a little bit different, right? Like a length of runway that people need more help, more guidance, more confidence boost or less confidence boost. And so I think, having that feel as a leader is important. I know we do a lot of training here on how to delegate effectively. And, for some people you could delegate something, show them at once and they'll take it and run with it. For some people though, it just doesn't work that way. So there is a balance that isn't the same for every person. And I think leading teams effectively is kind of getting comfortable with that balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That's really important. So, Rebecca, how do you introduce and integrate new technologies in an industry that can traditionally be kind of resistant to that type of change?
Yeah, I mean, well, just backing up one step, before we build anything, we try to do as much as possible to understand the market and what the actual problems are that we're trying to solve. Like worst case scenario is we make assumptions about a problem that aren't true and build something that nobody wants. That's really the worst case scenario. So we really like to start with doing as much as we can to understand the market. For us, that's, talking to the people in your network that are working in the civil space. But also we do a lot of cold calling and just going down the directory and looking specifically for firms of a different size or geography and understanding what their problems are. We try to attend in-person events as much as possible, conferences, but also just local, drinks. You can learn so much from just a casual happy hour event. So that's been an important source of networking. And then I guess when it comes to adoption of the technology, let's say that you've done all of your work on the market, you found a great problem that's something that you invest in solving, and then you want to bring it to market. For me, what's been really helpful is thinking about what you can and can't control and really aligning your efforts with your sort of best shot at success. So we talk a lot about early adopters. And so what are the characteristics of companies that are most likely to adopt new technologies? For us, we found, a lot of smaller firms can be more agile, and some of these problems might even be more painful for them because they might not have, a major diversity in roles within the company. They may be operating without a particular role, so you can fill a gap that they just haven't even been able to hire for yet. So we spend a lot of time thinking about, who exactly we want to start with, because once you can just make a foothold into a slice of the market, you can show some success, develop case studies, then you can take that to other companies. And then other companies will say, okay, look, my competitor is doing this thing. My competitor is like submitting proposals in a tenth of the time, or like they're saving time on their topographic surveys. Just these are some examples from our own company. Why aren't we doing that? And then it makes it more easy for them to sell it internally as well, too, because they're looking at, the company next door, basically, that they know quite well, and they can borrow those examples. So yeah, that's always been our approach, is to start where people are willing, and then it sort of will just naturally spread from there.
Yeah, I think that's really important in today's world of a changing climate. And I think that there's another analogy and parallel there along, again, with engineering companies, because if you're an engineer, and let's say for me personally as a civil engineer, if I was to hire to improve a roadway that had businesses on it, parks on it, it would really make the most sense for me to get out there in the public and talk to the people who lived and worked on that roadway to understand how we could best improve the roadway, as opposed to, again, making some assumptions and just redesigning the road, right? Or redesigning the parks, right? So I think anytime, even in the world of engineering projects, when you can get some feedback from stakeholders as early as possible before you dive in too deep, it's going to be helpful. I mean, I think it's obviously in the tech world, you're at a real, you have to put a lot of time and money and effort into developing something. So you don't want to do it unless it's definitely necessary. But I think the same goes for our projects, because you
Yeah.
have a scope on your project and a fee for your engineering project. And if your fee is to provide 3 design concepts and you do 3 of them without getting feedback from the client, you might have just burned through that budget, and then you got to do 3 more.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to extend that analogy one more time, like for us, we're a software company, we sell to our customers, which are civil firms. But if you're a civil engineering firm looking to adopt technology internally, for example, you can think of your employees as almost like your customers. And so you want this project to be successful, you need to understand their pain points, what their day is like. Most managers will know these things to some extent, but really doing them almost like the market research within an organization to make sure that your investment will be most successful is a big part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Rebecca, from your perspective, how is technology addressing challenges in engineering today? Where are some areas you see it happening?
Yeah, so many things, but for us, the biggest one that I like to point to is really around what we hear the most is around the shortage of qualified staff members. Almost every company that we talk to says that they're missing the middle. A lot of intermediate project managers and engineers, they're having a hard time fulfilling those roles and keeping them happy. At the same time, they've got a massive backlog of work in some cases, and so it's just kind of a recipe for a problem if left unchecked. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of benefits in addressing the staffing challenges. Some of the work that we do with Equator and providing LiDAR data to companies, they might have been waiting for a surveyor to go out to site. And in some states, we're hearing that there's a shortage of surveyors too. So it's really around the time of getting into the work. Yeah, you can throw money at problems sometimes to make them work a certain way. But if you can condense the project timelines, usually we hear that's what clients are most, that's what they're most looking forward to. It's like, how can we shrink this from, 2 years to maybe a year and a half to get this out and built on the ground faster?
Yeah, there's no doubt that that's an issue, is staffing. That's what all of the companies we work with tell us, is that there's more work than we can do, and we can't hire enough people fast enough to help us with that workload, which causes burnout in your existing staff. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities for tech and AI to help you maybe be more efficient and productive in the work that you're doing with the workforce that you have, which is definitely one solution for, an equation that just doesn't work out. Like more work, less engineers, it just doesn't kind of add up. So I definitely think if your company is exploring, or if your company is experiencing that problem, exploring how some technology can help you streamline your work processes and your project delivery to be able to do more with less people, that's going to help you with this middle manager issue of not just having enough people to do the work. And I think it'll probably get a little bit worse before it gets better, actually. So Rebecca, what strategies do you personally use to stay effective as a leader in a very high growth, like innovation driven company? What are you thinking about day to day for yourself to be effective?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me personally, I sort of have two major phases in a given project or effort in general. I think a lot about, something is starting up. I need to really look outwardly and get a lot of new information. That can be from, books, podcasts, clients, training to fill the gaps in knowledge that I don't have. I'm really trying to soak it all in, talking to people in my network to understand like what would be required of this project to make it successful. But then the other half of it is I find once I've spent a lot of time looking outward to sort of inform the baseline, then I start to think about how to look inward too. And there's sort of like the quiet phase where you're processing all of that information and you're doing something with it. There is an element, I have to say, of like intuition in all of this, and just letting all of that information that you've taken in sit with you, and then start to think of, okay, what are the problems that we're facing in this project, and just sort of naturally letting ideas and solutions emerge. So yeah, that's something I've really honed in over the past few years, is how to be effective in that way.
Like being more patient and letting things unfold a bit so you can adapt along the way.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not sure I explained that very well, but just like when are we I guess simply put is like, when are we in an information gathering phase? And then when are we in a phase where we need to look internally? We already have all the information and we need to use that information to do things really effectively now. And being intentional about that. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, that makes sense. So, Rebecca, as the new co-host of the AEC Leadership Podcast, what excites you about this opportunity, and what do you kind of hope to bring to the show?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm still at the very beginning of my leadership career. Yes, I've started a software startup, and I have a few years in that now, learning a lot of things. But the main reason why I'm so excited about co-hosting with you, Anthony, is I just am so excited to meet all of the wonderful guests that you bring onto this show. It's a personal interest. I want to learn from them. I want to hear their strategies. I want to have great conversations with the guests that are coming on as well. Selfishly, so that I can be a better leader, but I know that we have a pretty big audience here, and there's a lot of people that feel the same way. So I'm just really excited to be part of that.
No, we're excited to have you, and I think your leadership journey, even what you've gone through already, I'm sure you'll be able to bring some really good ideas and probably questions to the table for other leaders based on, what you've dealt with, which is great. So just in terms of leadership, what would you say just so far in your career, maybe is some of the best leadership advice that you've received from other leaders or mentors, and maybe how has that influenced you if it has?
Yeah, I mean, this maybe won't be shocking to you or your audience, but I early on when we started this business, I realized, I'm the CEO of the company, but I can still be fired. I had somebody who's on our board sort of remind me that the needs of the CEO change every year, especially as you're growing, right? And so
Right.
he was basically pointing out that like your main job is to learn fast enough to keep up with the growth of the company. And you might fall behind a couple years, and then you might suffer the consequences. I mean, that's a pretty extreme example, but it's true, right? Like once you grow and there's other people that have a stake in the business, if you haven't kept up, if you're not doing the job, like you're at risk just as much as anybody else. So I took that as more permission to enter on this journey, not just from the perspective of making the business successful, but also making, growing as a leader too, and learning as much as I can and making my own self as successful as possible in this career position.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think, in fact, I was having this conversation with, our COO the other day here that like, I want to get a performance review,
Yeah.
like as the CEO, like, and, I know that there are things out there like a 365 that could be helpful and feedback from different people, but I do think as a leader, it's important for you to get regular feedback. And I'm sure if you're a leader in an engineering company, you likely have a supervisor of some sort and you're getting some kind of performance review, which is great. But I think as you move up the ranks in an organization, you become a higher level leader. Sometimes the feedback isn't as good for a multitude of reasons. And I think it's important to continue to get feedback, which I think why as a leader, you want to get feedback from your team members as often as possible, because they're obviously going to be, as long as you put them in a comfortable situation to give that feedback, whether it's anonymous or whether it's you just built a really good relationship with them and they know that they can come to you and ask you to improve on something, it'll help you to become a better leader because you will get that feedback loop that we've been talking about throughout this episode, just in terms of your own leadership abilities, which I think is so important for growth.
Right, exactly. And if you're stagnant, like it's no surprise that the business would also have challenges as well too.
Yeah, for sure. So, Rebecca, last question for you. What final piece of advice might you give to leaders out there in the architecture, engineering, construction world, just looking to maybe drive innovation and growth in their own organizations?
Yeah, we already spoke a little bit about this, but I'm just going to go back to the concept of an MVP, a minimum viable product. Say you have an internal initiative or a project or a problem that you want to solve. I would really encourage teams to get more comfortable with the concept of failing fast and iterating towards a solution rather than building in a vacuum without that feedback, as you said. Build that right into the process. It's something that we found a lot of success with. And I know a lot of other companies that are trying to innovate as much as possible, find success with. So, you might not be a software startup, but there's a lot of great principles that can be learned that can be helpful, for building and changing your own internal processes as well.
Yeah, and I would say that in order to fail fast, one of the things we have to do as leaders in engineering is probably take more risks than we're comfortable taking. Because when you take a risk, that's how you kind of try something different that may not work, but then you get the feedback that you're looking for. So I think at the end of the day, like we've said on this show before, I'll say it again, pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone as a leader is going to be really important. And I feel like as technical professionals, that sometimes is even harder to do because our comfort zone is like technical expertise, which is this little comfort zone with all these other things outside of it. But the way that we fail faster is we get outside of that comfort zone. We mess something up, we learn, and then we kind of get better at it. And I think we
Yeah.
need to keep doing
Yeah, and
that.
it might seem counterintuitive, but I think if we can get all of our people more comfortable with that concept, then it will actually push us to grow more as well as people, especially young engineers. They might not feel as comfortable sharing what they don't know. Seeing the people around them, their leaders trying things and being really open and honest with, hey, this is something new. We're running this as an experiment. It might fail. Here's the framework, but we're moving towards this kind of success. It will give your people much more confidence as well to share with you what they don't know, their limits, and push towards growth.
Absolutely. Well, she is Rebecca Swabey. She's a professional engineer. She's the new co-host of the AEC Leadership Podcast. And she's also the CEO and co-founder of Equator Studios. We're so happy to have her on board with us here on the show. We've got a lot of interesting topics that we plan to explore, whether it's together on some episodes or having guests and other leaders out there in the industry. We really do look forward to it. And if you want to check out kind of what she's done and what she's building, you can check out equatorstudios.com. She's done a great job with building this business, and we're excited to get to kind of pick her brain more on that as we go forward. So Rebecca, thank you so much for, first of all, spending time today on the podcast and for agreeing to be a co-host going forward. We're really looking forward to it.
I'm so looking forward to it. Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rebecca. I'm thrilled to have her as a co-host on this podcast. There are a lot of awesome topics that we're going to dive into and guests that we will interview. If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe to our channel here. I will put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help engineers become better managers and leaders. I'll see you next week.